Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was a late December evening when I first arrived at my uncle's cabin deep in the Texas piney woods. It had been a long drive, about 4 hours from the city, and the air was already turning bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath come out in visible puffs. The roads were narrow, bordered by thick trees that seemed to swallow up the horizon. There were no lights out here, just the dark shadows of the pines reaching into the sky. The quiet was absolute, almost eerie. I remember feeling a certain relief as I parked my car in front of the cabin, leaving the city's constant noise behind. I hadn't realized just how much I needed a break from the hectic pace of school until I was surrounded by this kind of silence. The cabin itself was old but charming, weathered wood that had darkened over the years, its logs sturdy and solid, holding the structure upright against the biting winter. A single porch light flickered above the door. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door, and the scent of pine and firewood greeted me as I stepped inside. My uncle had always been a recluse, and his cabin reflected that. The furniture was worn, the carpets faded, but there was a warmth to the place that put me at ease. A stone fireplace took up the far wall, with a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. A couple of old hunting rifles hung above the mantel, their wooden stocks smooth and polished from years of use. I went about settling in, unpacking a duffel bag, setting up my things on the small kitchen counter. It was the kind of place that made you want to read a book, sit by the fire, and not think about the outside world for a while. My uncle had asked me to check on the pipes, keep the place warm, and feed the neighbor's dog. Simple enough, right? So that's exactly what I did. The first few days passed in a blur of solitude. I spent my time chopping firewood, feeding the dog, and reading the few books my uncle had left behind. By the time the third night rolled around, I had fallen into a predictable rhythm. I knew where everything was, and it felt oddly comforting to be so far away from everything. But then, that third night, something happened. I was sitting on the couch, the fire crackling quietly in the background, when I was suddenly jolted awake by a sound from outside. At first I thought I was imagining things. It wasn't uncommon to hear branches shift in the wind or the occasional scurrying of small animals outside. But this was different. It was deliberate, like footsteps crunching through the frost-covered ground. I glanced over at the clock. I couldn't make out what it was at first. I could make out the faintest movement through the window. There, between the trees, I saw someone, moving. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall. It wasn't walking, but pacing slowly back and forth as if it had nowhere to be but in that exact spot. I sat there frozen, staring at the movement. It was hard to make out any details. The figure was too far away, hidden by the thick trees. But the way it moved, the way it kept returning to the same spot over and over, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to reason with myself. It could be a hiker, lost in the woods, or maybe someone hunting in the dead of night, though that seemed odd. Why would they be out there pacing instead of hunting? I glanced around the cabin, my eyes landing on the rifle hanging above the fireplace. I took a slow, deliberate breath and leaned forward, peering out the window again. The figure had stopped moving for a moment, standing motionless in the dark. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rustling the tree branches. My mind raced. Should I call someone? Should I go outside and check? But the thought of stepping into the cold night alone made my chest tighten. I stayed inside, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. Eventually, the figure moved again, back into the darkness between the trees. I sat in the same spot, staring out the window. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually I saw the figure vanish completely into the night. I didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. The wind played tricks on your mind out here, especially when the trees creaked and moaned under the weight of the cold. It was probably a deer or a shadow from the trees, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I went about my day in a kind of daze, feeding the dog and checking the cabin's pipes. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The crisp air outside did little to calm the tightness in my chest. I was walking along the path that led down to the small creek when I saw something strange. Fresh footprints in the snow. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the prints. They were large, deep. Someone had been here recently. I followed them, careful to stay quiet, my boots crunching softly in the snow. The footprints led me further into the woods, then stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. That's when I saw it, the collapsed barn. I had heard my uncle mention the barn before. It had been an old property, long abandoned after a storm had come through months earlier. The barn had collapsed under the weight of the wind, leaving nothing but a pile of rotting wood and twisted metal. But what I didn't expect to find was evidence that someone had been living here. The area smelled foul, like rot and decay. I could see piles of old blankets, torn and stained with something dark. Empty cans, bottles, and wrappers littered the ground. There was an old fire pit, long extinguished, but with scorch marks still visible on the stones. And something else, an old half-empty gas canister. It was tipped over, the remnants of fuel slowly soaking into the earth. I felt my stomach twist with a mixture of disgust and dread. Someone had been living out here in this abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and now they were out there in the woods. I turned to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hurried back to the cabin, the path feeling longer than before, my footsteps quick and uneven as I tried to outrun the fear that was slowly creeping up on me. By the time I reached the cabin, I was out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the door behind me, not bothering to glance out the window this time. I didn't need to look. I could feel it, that heavy presence outside, waiting. The cabin was deathly quiet again, but not in the peaceful way it had been before. This silence felt wrong. Something was out there, and it wasn't just an animal. As the hours dragged on, I kept glancing at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. again. The time had come. I sat in the darkness, rifle resting on the arm of the couch. My fingers curled around the cold metal. My pulse was racing, my breath shallow. I stared out the window, but this time I wasn't going to make the same mistake. I wasn't going to let the figure disappear into the shadows without taking action. And sure enough, at exactly 2 a.m., I saw him again. The figure was back, moving through the trees, slowly, deliberately, as if he knew I was watching. He was closer this time, like almost at the edge of the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched him stop, standing just outside the cabin's perimeter. My hands shook as I reached for the porch light, flicking the switch. The bright light flooded the area, but the figure was gone, as though he had never been there. The woods were still again, no sign of movement, no sound, just the wind rustling through the trees. I was ready to breathe a sigh of relief, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on the snow, coming closer. Closer. There was a knock on the door, then another, and another. Heavy, frantic pounding. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling as I dialed 911. I barely managed to explain what was happening before the line went dead. It felt like forever before the police arrived, though I know it was only a matter of minutes. When they found the man, he wasn't just some lost hiker or wanderer. He was a fugitive, wanted for a string of robberies and home invasions. He had been living in the woods for months, surviving by stealing from cabins, and he had been stalking me, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't shake the image of him, standing outside the cabin so close, yet so far. The man who had been watching me from the trees. I left that night, my hands still shaking as I packed my things into the car. The drive back to the city was a blur, the streets lit by the headlights, the memory of the woods still fresh in my mind. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that figure, pacing back and forth in the darkness. I'm Jake, and I've spent most of my life in the woods. I grew up hunting, hiking, and fishing in the backwoods of East Texas. My family's cabin is deep in the piney woods, isolated, quiet, with no cell service and no distractions. It's the kind of place where the world feels like it's on pause, and it's where I go to reset when everything gets too loud. In early November, I decided to take a week off from work and spend some time there alone. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone at the cabin, but something about this trip felt different. I was craving solitude. Just me, nature, and nothing else. I packed up my gear, loaded up the truck with supplies, and set out for the cabin, leaving civilization behind. The road to the cabin was long, rough, and riddled with potholes, but once I made it, I could feel the weight of the world slipping off my shoulders. The first 2 days were peaceful. The air was crisp, with just enough chill to remind you that fall was settling in. Each morning, I'd wake up early, make some coffee, and sit on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders as the sun broke through the towering pines. The smell of pine needles and wet earth filled the air. The sound of wind whistling through the trees was the only thing I could hear for miles, aside from the occasional crow or squirrel rustling in the underbrush. I spent my afternoons hiking along the old trails, exploring spots I hadn't visited in years. There was a sense of freedom in it, a pure feeling of being away from everything. By evening, I'd light a fire inside the cabin, sit in the rocking chair by the hearth, and watch the flames dance while the shadows in the room flickered. I'd eat whatever canned food I had brought and then turn in early. The silence at night was comforting, though it occasionally felt a little too quiet. The third day, things started to change. I was out on one of my usual hikes, following a narrow trail that ran along a dried-up creek. The woods were dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The path was overgrown in places with thorny brambles reaching out to grab at my legs, but I didn't mind. I'd always enjoyed the physicality of a good hike. It was part of the charm of this place. The quiet, the solitude. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't passed another person in days. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I spotted him, standing in the middle of the path, leaning on a shovel. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark stubble on his chin and a weathered look about him. His clothing looked official: green shirt, khaki cargo pants, boots that had seen a lot of miles. He was wearing a park ranger hat. For a moment, I hesitated. There shouldn't have been any park rangers around here. The area was far from any park headquarters, and I hadn't seen a ranger on the road to the cabin either. But I didn't question it immediately. Maybe he was doing some kind of survey or maintenance work. This place wasn't as remote as it seemed, after all. He greeted me with a curt nod. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I returned the greeting, but something in the way he was standing made me pause. "You out here by yourself?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as they scanned me. "Yeah, just taking a break for a few days," I replied, trying to shake off the discomfort that was starting to settle in my stomach. His gaze shifted toward the direction of the cabin. "You staying alone out there, then?" His tone was almost too friendly, like he was trying to read me. I nodded, my unease growing. "Yeah, just me." "All right, well, you should be careful," he continued, his voice turning more serious. "There have been reports of mountain lions in the area. They're getting more aggressive, especially after dark. Best stay inside once the sun goes down." He paused, his eyes lingering on me again, and then added, "Lock your doors. Don't take chances." I nodded quickly, not wanting to stay in the conversation any longer. I could feel his eyes on me even as I started to walk past him. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me. As I passed by, I noticed his boots were covered in mud, but his uniform was oddly pristine, like it had been washed recently, even though we were deep in the woods. I tried to shake off the feeling and continue on my hike, but that encounter lingered in my mind. But I kept walking, my senses on edge. By the time the sun began to dip behind the pines, I had made it back to the cabin. I took a long, slow breath, enjoying the fresh air and the peace of the woods. But I couldn't shake the thought of that man. As the evening settled in, I locked up the cabin and made myself dinner. The light from the fire flickered and danced across the walls. I double-checked the windows and doors. I always did this when I stayed out there alone. It wasn't out of fear, it was just habit. I had just finished my meal when I heard the first sound, a faint crunch of footsteps outside. I froze. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. Someone was walking outside, slow and measured. I sat still in the dark, straining my ears. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, getting closer to the front door. I gripped the arm of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone was walking around the cabin, testing the locks. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, the doorknob rattling. Someone was trying to get in. My heart raced in my chest. I slowly reached for my rifle, leaning it against the armrest, my fingers trembling slightly as I wrapped my hand around the stock. I held my breath, listening, praying that whoever was out there would just leave. But instead, the footsteps grew louder, circling around to the windows. I could hear the soft tapping of fingers on the glass, the sound of someone pressing their face to the window, trying to peer inside. I stayed frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. It felt like hours before the footsteps finally began to fade, but I didn't dare move until I couldn't hear them anymore. My mind was racing. Who was it? Was it that ranger? My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I grabbed my emergency radio, dialing in to the local sheriff's office. When the deputy answered, I quickly explained the situation. Then I heard the sound of approaching vehicles. The headlights of the rangers' trucks. I heard their boots crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. The two rangers were professional, efficient, but there was a visible tension in the air. After checking the locks and the perimeter of the cabin, they sat me down and delivered the news that made my stomach drop. "There's been no ranger assigned to this area this week, Jake," one of them said, his voice low. "We don't know who that was, but it wasn't a park ranger." My blood ran cold. The man from earlier wasn't a ranger. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just a bad experience. Maybe I was just tired or overreacting. But as I was packing up to leave, I saw him again. There he was, standing at the edge of the tree line. His eyes locked onto mine, and this time, he wasn't wearing the park ranger uniform. He was dressed in faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt, but he was holding a blood-stained axe, the blade catching the light in a way that made my stomach turn. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew right then that I had to get out. I turned to grab my gear and get to the truck, but the man started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. His eyes never left me, and with every step, I could feel my pulse rising. I grabbed my rifle and dashed out the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran through the dense forest, my legs burning as I pushed through the thick brush. The sound of his footsteps behind me was getting closer. He was gaining on me, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the road, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the gravel. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with adrenaline. I managed to stumble toward the ranger's patrol car that had been left behind. I barely had the strength to dial 911 as my fingers fumbled with the phone. Within minutes, the authorities arrived and the man was captured. He was a fugitive, wanted for several attacks on isolated cabins across the region. He'd been targeting people like me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I never stayed in that cabin again. I packed up and left for good. There's something deeply unsettling about being in the woods, where the only thing you can hear is the wind, and then realizing that someone has been listening to you the whole time. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. After the breakup with Sarah, my mind was a mess. I never imagined that something as trivial as a breakup could completely shake my world, but there I was, feeling like I couldn't breathe, drowning in my own thoughts. I needed to get away from everything. From the city, the people, the memories. So I decided to pack my bags, grab my dog Boone, and head out to the piney woods of East Texas. I found a small, rustic cabin tucked deep within the forest, far enough away that no one could disturb me. It was a few hours' drive, but the isolation was exactly what I needed. Just me, Boone, and the towering pines that stretched into the horizon. No towns, no neighbors, no distractions. The kind of place where you could clear your head, or so I thought. The cabin itself was old, built with thick, rough-hewn timber that smelled like the earth itself. There was something charming about it. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The windows were small and faded, the roof was covered in moss, and the porch creaked under the weight of my footsteps. Boone, my black lab, bounded out of the truck before I even had a chance to fully park. He was always excited about new places, new smells, and new adventures. His tail wagged furiously as he sniffed at the air, taking in the unfamiliar scents of pine and damp earth. I smiled at his enthusiasm. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking, and exploring the area. Boone ran through the yard, his paws kicking up dirt, and I took a moment to take it all in. As night began to fall, I got a fire started in the small stone fireplace inside the cabin. The warmth felt good, but the darkness outside was unnerving. It was so dark, in fact, that even the pale light of the moon couldn't penetrate the thick canopy of trees above. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. Boone, after a long day of running around, finally settled on the rug near the fireplace, his large head resting on his paws. But he didn't sleep. Not like he usually did. Instead, he sat up every few minutes, his eyes wide and focused toward the windows, his ears twitching, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. I kept glancing over at him, wondering what had him so keyed up. Maybe he had sensed some wild animal in the woods, or maybe he was just picking up on the weird, unsettling vibe I was feeling myself. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the stillness of the woods. There's always that feeling when you're in a place that's so isolated. You feel like you're being watched, even if you know you're not. I had Boone with me, and that should have been enough. I stood up from the couch and walked over to the window. I pressed my hand to the cold glass, peering out into the night. The trees stood still, the shadows long and deep, no movement, no sound except the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was just the forest. I let out a deep breath and turned away from the window. But then Boone started to growl. It wasn't a low, friendly growl. It was deep and menacing. His hackles were raised, his body tense. I froze. I looked at him and then back at the window. "Boone?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why. His growl deepened, louder now, and he stood up, pacing in front of the window. "Hey, it's okay," I said, my voice trying to sound calm. But Boone wasn't listening. He wasn't even looking at me. He was staring out into the darkness with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and went to the door. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon or a deer had wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob. But Boone kept growling, low and steady. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. I opened the door just a crack and peered out into the night. I didn't see anything. Nothing except the dark trees swaying gently in the wind. I closed the door slowly, locking it behind me. Boone was still pacing, still growling. I stood there, listening to the soft creaking of the wood around me. Then the wind picked up. The pines outside began to groan. I settled back into the chair by the fire, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Boone eventually curled up on the rug, though he was still restless. I tried to get some sleep. The days that followed were more of the same. The mornings were beautiful, quiet and still, the sun filtering through the dense trees. But Boone's behavior grew stranger and stranger. He refused to leave my side, constantly pacing and whining, his eyes darting toward the woods at the slightest sound. The deep, unsettling growls continued, and sometimes he would sit on his haunches, staring out the window, as if waiting for something to emerge from the trees. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the unease was building inside me, gnawing at my nerves. One morning, I went outside to clear my head, to try and push away the feeling that something was wrong. Boone followed me, of course, but he wasn't running like he usually did. He was walking in slow, cautious steps, his eyes scanning the trees. I walked toward the edge of the property, my boots crunching against the dry dirt and dead leaves beneath me. Boone stopped a few paces behind, his ears pressed flat against his head. I turned around to call him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the woods, his body rigid. I frowned, my unease growing. "Boone, come on, we're just going to look around a little." But Boone didn't budge. It was like he didn't even hear me. I took a step toward him, and that's when I saw it. Broken branches. Everywhere. Not small, brittle twigs like I might expect from a squirrel, but thick, sturdy branches that had been snapped in half, scattered across the ground. Some of them were fresh, the wood still green, while others looked older, weathered by time. They weren't just scattered in random places, either. They were laid out like a path leading deeper into the trees. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. I looked up at Boone, who was still staring into the woods, and I could feel the sweat begin to form on my brow. Something was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had caused those branches to snap wasn't normal. I stood up and began walking back toward the cabin. That's when I saw him. He was standing between the trees, just barely visible in the shadow of the pines. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline of his figure, tall, thin, and unmoving. He wasn't facing me, but I could feel his presence. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Who's there?" I called out, my voice unsteady. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't even twitch. It was like he was just waiting. I took a step back. Boone's low growl rumbled in his chest, and his tail was stiff, his eyes locked onto the figure. I blinked, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned quickly and rushed back to the cabin, Boone trailing closely behind me. I locked the door behind us, my hands trembling as I did. But things didn't get any better. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Boone's behavior had become more erratic, more anxious. He would growl at nothing, bark at the trees, and refuse to go outside. I spent most of my time inside, trying to avoid looking out the windows. But the dread was building. I needed to leave. The final straw came one morning when I discovered the offerings: a dead squirrel, wildflowers, and worst of all, a small, crude stick figure. It sat on the porch step, staring up at me with its jagged lines and uneven limbs. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my mind racing with horrible thoughts. Who could have left this here? I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to leave. As I packed my bags, Boone didn't settle. He paced, whined, and looked toward the door like he knew something was coming. I loaded up the truck as quickly as I could, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the deputy. He was standing on the side of the dirt road, leaning against his car with a weary expression. I slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "You've been out at that cabin, haven't you?" he asked, his voice slow and deliberate. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, I'm leaving now." He gave me a long, assessing look. "I figured as much. You're not the first. There's a man who lives out in those woods. Been living there for years. Older guy, real quiet. He's got some issues, schizophrenia most likely, but he's harmless. Just watches folks who stay at that cabin. Leaves them little gifts." I blinked, confusion flooding my chest. "You mean he's been watching me?" The deputy nodded. "It's what he does. Sometimes he fixes his attention on someone for a while, watches them from the trees, doesn't approach, just leaves little offerings like that." He gestured toward the woods. "Nothing to be scared of, just a lonely man, lost in his mind." But the horror of it sank in like a stone in my stomach. The whispers, the figure in the woods, the dead animals, it was all him. He had been watching me this whole time. I drove away, my mind spinning. I was safe, but the thought of that man hidden somewhere in those woods, still watching, was something I couldn't shake. I'm back home now, but I don't think I'll ever forget those days in the woods, and I certainly won't be going back. I've always been one to take the scenic route. It wasn't my idea to go all the way out to rural Texas for my college buddy's wedding. He'd been the kind of guy I'd known briefly back in school, someone you'd share a couple of beers with but never really get close to. But for some reason, he insisted that I make the trip, and despite everything, I couldn't exactly say no. I had already driven for hours through endless stretches of highway, the flat landscape of Texas spreading out on either side, dotted here and there by the occasional farmhouse or rundown shack. The road was long, straight, and mostly empty, and I found myself struggling to stay awake behind the wheel. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a reddish-orange glow across the sky, and the shadows in my rearview mirror stretched out further than I felt comfortable with. It was around then that I noticed something odd. The car had been running fine, but suddenly the engine sputtered, like it was choking on something, and the sound of it made my heart skip a beat. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep the car steady, but it felt as if I was losing control with every passing second. It lurched forward, and I pulled over as fast as I could. I rolled the car to a stop on the side of the road, the tires crunching over gravel. I popped the hood, hoping to see something obvious, like a loose wire or a belt that had snapped, but of course I had no clue what I was looking for. I leaned over the engine, trying to make sense of the mess of metal and hoses, but nothing stood out. I ran a hand through my hair and muttered to myself, wondering what to do next. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. There were no other cars, no signs of life around here, just the occasional rustling of pine trees in the wind. The sun was fading fast, and the temperature was starting to drop. I felt the panic bubbling up inside me. I didn't want to be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere, especially as darkness began to creep over the land. I decided to get out of the car and try walking to the nearest town, even though I had no idea how far that might be. My stomach growled as I grabbed my bag, but I figured I'd manage. After all, it couldn't be that far, right? I started down the narrow dirt road, kicking up little clouds of dust as my boots hit the ground. I walked for what felt like an eternity. The sun had fully set, and the only light now was from the fading red of the horizon. I began to wonder if I should have stayed by the car, waiting for help. My legs were starting to ache, and my breath came in short, uneven bursts. The only sound now was the wind rustling the trees and the occasional crunch of my boots on the ground. I was just starting to lose hope when I saw it. A small, weathered cabin in the distance, barely visible through the thick trees. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were no lights on, no signs of life at all, just the dim outline of the building standing in the growing darkness. I stopped walking and hesitated for a moment. The thought of seeking shelter in such a place felt strange, almost wrong. But I couldn't deny it. I was exhausted and I needed somewhere to rest for the night. The cabin seemed like the only option. I approached it cautiously, taking slow steps, my boots crunching on the dry leaves underfoot. There was a faint smell of dampness in the air, like the wood was rotting from the inside out. The door was slightly ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges, as if it hadn't been closed in years. A deep creaking sound echoed from the door as I gently pushed it open, and I winced. Inside, the air was thick with the musty odor of old wood and mildew. The dim light from the single window barely illuminated the room. The furniture, what little there was of it, looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. A few chairs were scattered about, a rickety wooden table sitting in the middle of the room, and a small unlit fireplace in the corner. The walls were bare, save for some old nails sticking out and a few peeling strips of wallpaper. I stood at the entrance for a few moments, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. It was a strange feeling, standing there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The latch clanged against the frame with a hollow sound. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel right, but I had no choice. I dragged a chair over to the corner and sat down, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The cold air inside the cabin nipped at my skin, and the smell of mildew filled my nose. My eyes were heavy, and despite the discomfort, exhaustion took over. I figured I'd lock the door once I was settled in, but the thought of getting up again was too much. I let my head fall back against the wall, closing my eyes. Sleep came quickly. The strange feeling that I wasn't alone in that cabin stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind as I drifted off. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke up suddenly, my body tense and alert. It was still dark, the air thick with the kind of stillness that made everything seem heavy. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what had woken me. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it again. A soft, distant whisper. It was so faint that it barely registered at first, but it was unmistakable. Whispers. Low, hushed voices just outside the cabin. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voices were soft but insistent, like people were talking in a hurry. My eyes darted around the room, but all I saw was the same dim light, the same rotting furniture, and the same thick darkness pressing in around me. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the voices were coming from outside. I could hear the crunching of leaves underfoot, the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Whoever it was, they were close. Very close. I gripped the edge of the chair tightly, my palms slick with sweat. My heart pounded in my chest as the voices grew louder, but still I couldn't make out what they were saying. I told myself to stay calm, to think this through. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe it was nothing. But every time I peered through the window, I saw nothing but the thick blackness of the woods. All I saw was the swaying of the trees, their branches moving in the wind. Nothing. The voices seemed to be all around me, closing in. I retreated from the window, my legs unsteady beneath me. The whispering didn't stop. It seemed to come in waves, louder and quieter. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to get out, but the thought of stepping outside into the dark woods made my blood run cold. I shoved the chair under the door handle, trying to secure it as best as I could. My hands were trembling, my stomach a twisted knot of nerves. I sat back down, my mind racing. The sound of footsteps circled the cabin again, closer this time. I heard a soft tapping at the window, but when I looked, nothing was there. I almost screamed, but I bit it back. The whispers were still there, faint but constant, rising in urgency. My pulse was hammering in my ears. Every minute felt like an hour. I was stuck here, unable to leave. At some point, maybe it was an hour, maybe more, the whispers finally faded, their presence slipping away into the night. I didn't dare open the door until I saw the first light of dawn breaking through the cracks in the cabin walls. I stood up carefully, trying to ignore the stiffness in my legs. I thought about returning by car, hoping that any passing car might give me a ride. Soon, when I got closer, I saw my car, but it wasn't the same as before. The hood was popped open, and I could see clearly now that something had been tampered with. The engine was gutted, wires had been cut, parts were missing. A cold pit formed in my stomach as I realized what had happened. Someone had sabotaged my car. Just then, I heard the sound of an engine approaching, and I turned to see a pickup truck rattling down the dirt road toward me. The man behind the wheel looked worn, like life had beaten him down over the years. He slowed down and stopped beside me, giving me a once-over before rolling down his window. "You in trouble, kid?" he asked, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He looked down at my car, his eyes narrowing as he took in the damage. "Yeah, this stretch is bad news," he said slowly. "You got lucky. Most folks don't make it out of here. Squatters, people who live out in them woods. They'll mess with your car, take what they want, and leave you stranded. They don't care who you are, and some people even go missing around here." I swallowed hard, the fear creeping up on me again. "Squatters?" I asked, my voice shaky. The rancher nodded grimly. "Not the friendly kind. You'd best be careful. Ain't safe around here. Not in the woods." I nodded again, unsure of what else to say, and climbed into the truck. The ride into town was quiet, the old truck rattling along the dirt road as we passed by fields and trees. My mind kept replaying the events of the night, the whispers, the footsteps. When we arrived at a small diner in town, I could barely eat. The rancher left me there, but not before giving me one last warning. "You take care now. Some folks around here ain't meant to be found." I tried to shake it off, but the words stuck with me like an echo in my mind. I went back to the cabin later, stepped with a mechanic and a local deputy in tow. They didn't find anyone, no squatters, no trace of whoever or whatever had been out there with me. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. Something had been out there in the woods, and it hadn't been just the wind. Something had been watching me. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.